Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan here in Tokyo. I'm Anthony Rowley. I'm head of the task force that organizes these events. They're called deep dives, in which we ask panels of experts to discuss topics of current interest. And I think, given the steaming hot and humid summer that we've endured here in Tokyo and still are enduring, I think climate change is very much at the forefront of most people's minds. We have four panelists today to discuss the issue, as I said, and I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. We have Ms. Karlygash Zhunussova, who's a senior economist in the Climate Policy Division of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. She will be speaking first, followed by Sonja Gibbs, who's Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Finance at the Institute of International Finance in Washington, D.C. Both of those are speaking from Washington. And then we have David Raitzer, who is Senior Economist in the Asian Development Bank Research and Development Impact Department in Manila. He's also online from Manila. And finally, on my left, we have Akio Takemoto, who's Head of Program and Administration at the United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability. So we'll get underway quickly. As I said, I think this is an extremely topical issue that we have, and I think a lot of people now are asking the question, what is being done, and is it too late to save the planet? I know that's slightly dramatic, but nevertheless, I think we're all experiencing climate change at first hand, not only in hot weather, but also in hurricanes, typhoons, flooding, and so on. So it is now very much impacting the public perception. Okay, with that, I'll ask Ms. Zhunussova to begin her presentation, please, if you would. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let me share my screen. Okay.
Yes, we can see.
Okay. You see the slides, right? Okay, good. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Karlygash Zhunussova. I'm the economist at the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund. And every year I think this is our fourth year in a row, we write the analysis on taking the stock take of mitigation ambitions by the countries before COP conferences. And every year, unfortunately, the situation is getting more drastic. So this is our forthcoming MS staff analysis. It will be the staff climate note that will be published a week later. I wrote it with two other authors from our division. It's Simon Black and Mr. Ian Parry. So I will quickly, I think, given that I have only 15 minutes, I will quickly go, I will skip the context and we'll go straight to the ambition and then implementation gaps, how to get the ambition on track, and the conclusion. So in the context, we know that the Paris Agreement is a major achievement, but it was insufficient in ambition, and that was known from the beginning. And the operating logic was that there will be the ratcheting mechanism when countries will review and adjust and increase the ambition of their commitments. So this is actually the time in 2025 when the countries will have to submit their updated NDCs that will have to be more ambitious. So this analysis is very relevant right now when the countries need to take a look and make sure that this is that the ambition will lead us within 2 degrees or preferably 1.5 degrees. Last year in Dubai, the agreement was to reach 43% cut by 2030 and 60% cut by 2035 for 1.5. Unfortunately, currently this is insufficient anymore because when these reduction cuts were calculated, the assumption was that the countries will start to decrease their emissions, but except for the COVID, when the global emissions decreased, actually global emissions kept increasing all the time. So this is the updated version. We have pretty much a mountain to descend. We can see that currently, according to our calculations, the greenhouse gases will have to be cut by 25% below 2019 levels by 2030 to reach 2 degrees, to stay within 2 degrees Celsius, and for 1.5 it should be 50% below 2019 levels. However, the country targets falling short. So the most recent generation of NDCs, this gray line, it reaches only around 12% reduction in 2030. So the ambition, this very big, large red arrow, it is the ambition gap. So for 2030, the ambition needs to be doubled or even quadrupled. So if we now take a look at the ambition gap, what we see that it is not only the problem of the developed countries anymore, the whole world needs to decarbonize. So high-income countries currently account for 28% of current emissions, and their share is expected to decline by 2030. And additionally, developing countries now increasing. So the upper middle income countries, lower middle income countries, and low middle income countries, they are cumulatively increasing their emissions if we account the historical emissions. So now the whole world needs to coordinate and start to decarbonize. Otherwise, what we will discuss the I will show what is happening otherwise. So basically, we also can do the analysis to see the NDC ambition, how it increased since the first generation of NDCs in 2015. So we can see for example, high-income countries increased their ambition almost triple their ambition. The upper middle-income countries increased them from 9 to 14% reduction against the business as usual in 2030, and low and lower middle income countries in the last 5 years didn't change their ambition much. And a lot of countries, about 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions are currently covered by long-term net zero targets. And some of them, I think it's only one country, several countries that before 2050, a big bulk is 2050, 2060, and then some countries have after 2060. However, the real challenge is coming to us much, much sooner, because this is what will happen if 2030 targets will not enhanced. So what is needed for 1.5C, it is this green line. And if 2030 NDCs at the level they are currently are, what would be needed to go back on track to stay within 1.5 degree is to cut emissions 75% in 5 years, from 2030 to 2035, and then from 2030 to 2040, it will require 7% decline on average each year. For comparison, the coronavirus decrease in emissions was 6%. And then net zero emissions will have to come in 2040, so a decade earlier than currently countries are planning. And after 2040, actually the countries will have to start removing emissions, which is quite expensive. So this is implausible technologically, because a lot of sectors like building, transport, industry, the stock is sometimes slow, right? Economically, it is massive economic shock, and politically, it wouldn't be tolerated by the public. So if 2030 targets are not enhanced, 1.5C would be out of reach. So that is a bit of a grim picture. Now the implementation, let's talk about implementation gap, because it's one thing that countries are promising to decrease emissions, and is the other thing on what they're doing. So one of the most popular options is to start pricing carbon. So it is carbon taxes, ETSs, or different other pricing schemes. Currently, there are around 70 carbon pricing initiatives around across 40 countries, and a lot of countries are thinking about implementing them. Collectively, they cover around 23% of global emissions. And on average, the price, if we weighted average, it would be around $20 per ton. But if we take into account all the emissions that are not priced and also subsidized, because a lot of countries still have fossil fuel subsidies, actually the weighted average global price would be around $5 per ton. And to reach the 2C, the world would have to require around $85. So it's much more additional increase in prices as well. It's actually higher than our previous estimate. As I said, we've been writing this analysis for several years now. And the problem is that countries keep postponing their implementation. So the price keeps increasing. But also countries do a lot of sectoral policies, such as here's the example of the G20 countries. They do the renewable pledges, they do coal phase outs. In the transport sector, there are standards for CO2 per kilometer and the EV implementation targets. And many countries have the targets in the buildings and industry. So sectoral policies are also in place. But the big elephant in the room is that global fossil fuels subsidies unfortunately remain large. So this is the analysis that we update every 2 years. And the 2023 analysis was calculating that the direct and indirect implicit and explicit subsidies were around 7 trillion in 2022. So this is around 7% of the global GDP. So we can see that first, there is a big need to increase the ambition, and second, currently countries are trying to move in the right direction, but the pace is just not enough. So how to get the ambition on track? Actually, this is very, very old question, how to distribute the mitigation burden equitably. So, and there are 6 different approaches, broad approaches in the literature. It can be based on the grandfathering, or it could be the gradual convergence, or the ability to pay. And these are different ways of how big countries will have to decrease their emissions in 2030 relative to 2010 if we will calculate their mitigation burden according to the 6th principle. So what we did in our analysis, this is the illustrative example. We calculated the estimated emission cuts implied by the 6 different approaches in the business as usual. We took the simple average across these different approaches because some of them are very heavily inequitable, and some of them are too much, like, put a lot of burden on the developed countries. So we averaged the 6 of them. Then we calculated the relationship between the projected business as usual emissions and projected per capita. And then based on this inferred slope, we calculated the estimated emission targets versus the business as usual for all the countries. And then it's just the question of calibrating to find out what will each country will have to do to reach the global target of 25 or 50% reduction. So this is the illustrative 2C aligned enhanced greenhouse gas emissions targets for 2030. So as we can see, the slope is steep. So the developed countries will have to bear the most of the emission decrease, whereas the low-income countries, middle-income countries will have to have lower decreases in emissions. If we want to see, we also calculate the 1.5 aligned illustrative targets, and these are the zoom in for the countries. So as we can see, the green diamonds are the illustrative 1.5C fair share targets, and the blue triangles are the 2C. Some countries already have their indices more or less close to at least 2C when it comes to high-income countries, and some upper middle income countries already have their indices aligned, but unfortunately none of the major emitting countries have their NDCs aligned with 1.5. And yeah. And if we then look at the at these scenarios, if we will put them to the calculations, so the reductions will be within the ranges. And actually, for 2030, the per capita emissions will start to converge. So the upper middle income countries will have the same level of per capita emissions as high income countries for 2C, and even higher for 1.5C. We can also calculate the fiscal impacts for 2030. So if the countries will use different ways of carbon pricing to reach these reductions, then they will raise revenues, and these revenues will be, in most cases, enough to cover the base erosion, at least for 2030. And the welfare impacts, because if introducing the new taxes, there will be welfare cost, and the abatement costs will be globally around 0.4% of GDP of 2030. This is the annual cost, and it will be offset by the domestic environmental benefits. Sorry, I will just, I know I'm over time, I apologize. Just one, this is second to last slide. We also calculated the 2035 emission, implied emission cuts that will be aligned with 1.5 but 2C. But as you can see, if 1.5C for 2035, the emissions will have to be cut for a lot of developed countries up to 80%, which is politically and economically, technologically very questionable to reach by 2035. So yeah, this is the conclusion that unfortunately the world is sleepwalking to implausible emissions cliff edge. And if the countries will not increase their ambition and put the implementation on track, 1.5C will be technologically, economically, and politically unachievable. We also do a lot of work on sectoral, sector-specific emissions, but this is our global overview. Interesting thing that in 2025, in 2025, when we wrote the first SCN on this topic, we started as not yet on track, but the implementation is still not happening, and now it's currently, we call the SCN sleepwalking to the cliff edge. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. A very frank presentation and very sobering. I think I'm interested to see the IMF using very blunt phrases like a wake-up call will be needed. Okay, let's move on to our next speaker, Sonja Gibbs, who will give us some perspective on what the private sector is doing generally to tackle this problem. Sonja, please.
All right, so great pleasure to be here with you this morning, and thanks, Anthony, and to the FCCJ for inviting us to be here. Great presentation from Karlygash, and I'm going to focus on the role of the financial sector as part of a broader ecosystem that we've got to have to reach transition, and that includes policymakers, regulators, as well, of course, as the United Nations, all the international organizations, NGOs, civil society, companies, and households around the world. Because if we don't make this a full-on collaborative endeavor, we will not be able to achieve the societal buy-in we need for transition, and certainly not going to be able to achieve the levels of financing and investment that we need to achieve it. So I did want to say just a quick word about the IIF, the Institute for International Finance in Washington, D.C. We're not as well known, of course, as the IMF, but we represent the private financial sector. We've got 400 members in over 70 countries, half of them from emerging markets. So it's banks, insurance companies, asset managers, pension funds, the whole spectrum. The public development banks and the multilaterals are also IIF members. So we specialize in public-private sector dialogue. That's our mantra here. Anthony, you asked a really good question. You know, whether all these efforts to mitigate the impact of climate change are being accelerated fast enough to keep pace with the fight against climate change. And the short answer, sadly, is no, right? I'm going to illustrate this here. Fully decarbonizing the global economy is going to need investment across all sectors. You know, Karlygash referred to doing sector-specific analysis. That's fundamentally important. McKinsey, for example, estimates that we're going to need on the order of $9 trillion annually through 2050 to get to a full net zero transition. Now, I want to make a really important point here up front. The financial sector can enable this investment. Absolutely. We can offer all manner of different financial products and services that are green and blue and multicolor. But capital is only going to move in support of net zero goals at scale when the economics of it makes sense. That's how private capital works, and that's our fundamental problem. This kind of investment is traditionally a public good financed by the public sector. But we all global pools of capital, including, of course, the private sector. So how do we mobilize that? That gets into a different discussion of things like blended finance, leveraging public finance in clever ways to scale up private finance. But the fact remains that it's a real challenge. First, I want to just level set quickly. What do we mean by transition finance? I think we've got a very good understanding of what green finance is. We have a European taxonomy. Many other countries have taxonomies. So green finance, that's pretty clear. And that's certainly part of transition finance. And so is clean technology finance. That's another piece of the transition finance puzzle. Managed phase out, so getting rid of things like coal plants in a sensible manner. But it also includes, and this is the vast majority of transition finance, it's all the industries in the world that may currently be quite brown, but have a plan to become green, need to become green in order to get us to transition. So what I'm saying, you can kind of see, is that ultimately all finance is going to have to be green finance. And to get to that, we have to go through a really challenging process of scaling up transition finance. And that gets me to transition planning. Great deal of focus on everybody needs to have a transition plan in place. And in some places like the EU, we're talking about mandatory transition planning and target setting. But there's three real challenges for the financial sector here. First, the financial sector is not in the driver's seat. Okay, transition needs a whole economy approach. So how fast we get to net zero is going to depend mainly on the effectiveness of government policy, not just financial sector policy, but across industries. Number two, finding global consensus and alignment on financial sector policy and regulation around things like climate risk and transition planning is very difficult. And this is resulting in fragmentation, including in really important areas like use of the regulatory capital framework, on disclosure, on taxonomy, consumer protection. And the big divide, let's be frank, is between the more laissez-faire approach of the United States and the much tighter regulation and effective steering of capital allocation. And that's much where the EU is headed with its policies and frameworks. Another interesting area where we see fragmentation is that major economies are pursuing nationally driven climate and what you might call good old-fashioned industrial policy. For example, the United States Inflation Reduction Act and the EU response, and many other countries are going in this direction. It's kind of a climate investment race, you might say, and that has global consequences. One real challenge we'll need to manage to is that if wealthy countries are all seeking to come out on top and attract sort of green investment and be the green finance center of the world, it's going to be important to enough that enough climate finance and transition finance goes to emerging and developing economies. And that's a huge concern because capital flows to emerging markets in general have been under pressure in an environment of rising global interest rates and, of course, high geopolitical tensions. So that's the first thing. Second, we need to be a lot clearer and kind of settle this debate on what is the role of the financial sector. When I talk to our members around the world, there is a really strong consensus that we in the financial sector and our regulators cannot front run the transition in the global economy. The immediate divestment from everything brown is in no way the answer. The growth can't take that hit. Economies can't take that hit. The entire economic model of many developing economies is fundamentally brown. You're cutting off an important source of finance. And then I go back to the need for finance to enable transition. So divestment is not the answer. It's going to need to be a two-track transition, financing the green and financing the shift from brown to green. Over time, the amount of finance that flows to green is obviously going to grow and grow exponentially, and the amount of finance directed to brown is going to shrink. But it can't simply be cut off. You can't turn out the world's lights. That doesn't happen. So financial services sector can support and engage with clients, kind of nudge them, to improve their own transition plans, help them plan it out. But we can't create demand for transition finance, right? You can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. That's going to come from policymakers using both incentives and disincentives. For example, carbon taxation or incentives like industrial policy type incentives like the IRA, or other disincentives like phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. Karlygash just had a wonderful slide on that. And just as a small side note here, all of the controversy over whether green assets can outperform brown assets. Well, all you'd have to do is have some kind of carbon pricing in place, and that question would be solved, and that would be just a massive, massive incentive. Sadly, we're not in a world where that's going to happen. It's politically unpopular, and you cannot get international agreement there. So many, especially sort of civil society, NGOs, are looking at the financial sector as an alternative to policy, looking to us to be climate policymakers. And that's completely inappropriate and not possible because different jurisdictions have different policies. And no one elected, the financial sector to set climate policy. Bottom line here is that we need to find a pro-growth approach to transition. And if we don't, there's going to be political backlash, social tensions, given that the costs of transition are so high. And it's particularly important for emerging and developing economies, which typically have much more carbon-intensive economic models, as well as high debt levels. Anthony, we've talked about this extensively, and significant political and currency risk. So I'm going to try to do something very challenging here and share my slides. All right, here we go. I am not very good at this. Screen. Everything on your screen. Let's see. Okay. Does that work?
I don't think it does. No, sorry.
I'm
very nice picture of you, but not the slide.
Then I have sent them through, and you can have them as leave behinds. I will just go through them quickly.
Please, yes,
because I know you want us to keep the time here. You'd asked about to what extent finance is flowing. And what I would say is that it's growing exponentially, but it's still very niche. And let me just give the example of sustainable debt markets. For all that we would like to sort of green the world's equity markets, debt is a primary form of finance and investment and will continue to be so for many decades to come. The whole debt universe, so everything sustainable, green bonds, blue bonds, transition bonds, sustainability linked bonds, all the kind of flavors here, they all total about 6.5 trillion US dollars as a universe. And that might sound like a lot, and it's gone from 0 to 60 miles an hour in about 10 years, right? But think about the size of the global debt markets, right? The global bond market is what, 120, 140 trillion. So this is just a tiny little slice of the action. So all these climate commitments that the financial sector has made, that's fantastic. And we're starting to see more flows, but it's still quite a small niche. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I won't go into, but suffice it to say, these are new instruments. They don't have a long track record. There's not a lot of liquidity in these markets, and that makes it hard for global investors to just sort of dive in at scale. I will say, on a very promising note, that we've done comparisons of like what you might call clean energy finance to fossil fuel finance. And the ratio of the one to the other back in 2015 was, close to zero, right? Most of all the financing that was going from financial firms to energy was to traditional fossil fuel energy. And now that ratio is close to 2/3. So close to 2/3 of clean energy now, close to 2/3 of all financing for energy now goes to clean energy, and only 1/3 for fossil fuel energy. Now, that has to obviously increase much further, but the progress is quite striking. So a lot of growth in clean energy finance. I want to say a word here about debt, Anthony. I know that's not our primary topic tonight, but I really feel you can't disentangle the two. I was very struck by a presentation recently from the IMF that I'm going to borrow the numbers from, which charts the rise in government borrowing. We all know that government debt is at record levels already, and the IMF estimates that by 2050, debt will have grown from around, government debt will add another 200 trillion on top of something like 250 trillion now. So getting close to doubling, and 1/3 of that increase in debt is going to come from climate spending. So then you've got to think about debt ratios. Anthony, we're already at around 100% of GDP for mature markets around the world. 100% of GDP. Remember when we were all sort of, fretting about getting over 60% as some benchmark? We're already 100. If we don't get like mega rapid nominal GDP growth around the world and debt levels double, what is going to happen to debt ratios? They're going to be unfinanceable. So this is something that really has to be thought through carefully and acknowledged by our politicians and policymakers, because the costs of transition, let me tell you, we're not hearing a lot about those. Another thing that's going to add to debt is all this industrial policy we've been talking about, right? I've got this wonderful chart here that charts the number of new, in what you might call industrial policies related to either climate or trade in general, the kind of me first industrial policies. In the US, I think they've charted something over like 800 of these since the beginning of 2023. And I don't have Japan on the list, interestingly enough. China's not far behind that, so there's a lot of focus on industrial policy here, and that costs money. So that leaves governments in a super challenging position, right? You might think of it as a sort of a fiscal policy trilemma. 3 big problems. Number one is political feasibility. We're in a year of a record number of elections. Nobody wants to rein in fiscal policy. I mean, how popular is that? It's not. That's in mature economies. In emerging economies, there's a real strong perception that the tax burden is unfairly distributed. There's a lack of trust in government. So you have making climate spending politically feasible is hard for governments. And there's also a growing demand for government spending. all the traditional things. There's aging population. There's now more defense spending on energy security and so on. Add in the climate transition and other sustainable development goals. There's more demand for government spending. And you've got higher interest rates, so governments are paying more in debt service. So, where's all this money going to come from? And then that adds up for many countries, especially in the developing world, to problems with debt sustainability.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Stunning stuff. But if I could just draw you to a 3-minute close, sorry, but we are running a little bit against the clock.
only 1 more minute.
Okay, fine, good.
Yep. Sorry. So if you look at sort of things like growing protests, social unrest over, things like food security and, climate protesters, these are really on the rise. So the political feasibility of all this spending is really, really challenging.
Mm.
So the only other things I would say are to highlight, the financial sector's role as an enabler, but not a driver of transition. So we need the right policy frameworks in place. We need a better kind of risk return profile for green investment relative to brown investment, and that's a policy decision. We can't make that happen.
Mm.
Economy-wide approach across all different sectors, and a supportive regulatory framework as well, right? One that doesn't stand in the way of transition finance, because you penalize everything that's brown as a regulator. You are inadvertently cutting off major swathes of sectors and many emerging and developing economies from getting the transition finance they need. I'll stop there.
Right. Okay. Oh, thank you. Well, again, a very sobering perspective, if I may say so. Okay, David Raitzer, if you could come in there, please. David, are you there? There you are.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm just setting up to share my screen. Just one moment.
Okay.
Okay, can everyone see?
We can't see. Oh, yes, we can now, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It's the first two presenters were excellent, so I hope I can be as clear as them. The talk I will have is not so much about, there's a little bit of finance, but this is a talk mostly about adaptation. So climate change impacts with reference to developing Asia, because that's our region, and how the region can respond in terms of adaptation. It's a preview of the ADB Asia Climate Report that we're launching at the end of the month. And it'll give you a taste of what to expect in that report and what we find. So it basically looks at climate futures for Asia and the Pacific. It looks at the vulnerabilities in sectors and the losses that could be possible under a high emission scenario out to 2070. And then it reviews how countries can respond in terms of adaptation policy, and how the possible responses and needs compare against responses to date and what more needs to happen. So unlike the first presentation, the focus here is much more on the what impacts climate change could have and how they can be directly dealt with, especially if we don't make the kind of rapid progress on mitigation that the first speaker outlined.
Mm.
So climate change is not only happening, but it's actually accelerating. Climate change is going faster as time passes. 2/3 of warming since the pre-industrial era has happened since 1970, and the rate of warming continues to increase. When integrated assessment models are run by the IPCC, they tend to find 3 degrees of mean warming under current policies and around 2.5 degrees of mean global warming under nationally determined contributions put forward to date. That assumes the nationally determined contributions are fully implemented and continue out and sort of continue on a similar level of effort thereafter. The models that are run are actually dated in terms of climate science. They reflect older general circulation models, not the latest understanding. And the understanding that's emerging indicates that the same level of emissions could potentially lead to much more warming. Equilibrium climate sensitivity, so basically the amount of warming associated with changes in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, those estimates have been gradually increasing over time. The latest increases aren't reflected in that modeling. And there are signs of positive feedback effects and tipping points, such as increasing methane emissions from natural ecosystems, glacial melt, reductions in sea ice cover, et cetera, that could potentially make warming go much faster than the models that we conventionally run. No matter what, we know the world is increasingly locked into a hotter, more variable future. Even if we radically cut emissions today, for decades, the world would continue to warm. And the warming over land that people are exposed to is much more dramatic than the warming that you see in the global averages, because those include the warming over the seas. And warming over the sea is much less than warming over land. And if you look within developing Asia, actually the patterns are even more pronounced. You'll have within particular locations much stronger changes, especially in particular seasons. Just to give a sort of flavor of what kind of changes we could expect, this was under a high emission scenario, but under a high emission scenario, all of Asia virtually would have more than a doubling of the days above 35 degrees centigrade. And in some areas closer to the tropics, it could be many, many more times than that, the increase in the number of days above 35 degrees. We'd be looking at a world that's much more concentrated and much more variable. Rainfall overall would increase, but it'd become much more concentrated in when it falls. There'd be much bigger differences between rainy and wet seasons, and much more intensive rainfall events, with a 50% increase in maximum daily precipitation in the Pacific, 40% in South Asia, 30% in East and Southeast Asia. So rainfall would become much more concentrated in specific events and periods. At the same time as rainfall overall would increase and become more concentrated, there will be more drought, as evaporation and evapotranspiration would increase with temperature, and they will rise faster than precipitation. Global sea level rise would be 0.8 meters, but when you look within developing Asia and you think about relative sea level rise, land subsidence, and so on, and the effects of storm surge, the effects are much, much stronger than you might think just from 80 centimeters of sea level rise by the end of the century under a high emission scenario. We, for this report, did some new modeling using a model that has technical advancements over the model that's typically used for analysis of coastal vulnerability. And we looked at the assets and infrastructure that could be at risk. And when we look at that in the context of economic growth, the losses that could occur by 2070 within the Asia Pacific region would be in the trillions of dollars under a high emission scenario from the combination of sea level rise and storm surge, with tens of millions of people affected annually. So sea level rise is a major risk for the region in the future. At the same time, river-based flooding will also increase. We have more concentrated rainfall under a high emission scenario, and you would also have, of course, glacial melt, which would increase flow from rivers. We reran an existing model of river-based flooding and considered it in the context of sea level of economic growth, and we find hundreds of billions of dollars of loss each year to industrial and commercial areas by 2070, with those losses concentrated in South Asia. I think people traditionally think of agriculture as very climate dependent. And so the agriculture would be a heavily affected sector by climate change. More recent science is a bit more mixed in that when you have high emissions, you have increases obviously in carbon dioxide concentrations, and that makes photosynthesis go faster. So there is an offsetting positive effect, but at the same time, there are going to be many more extreme events in terms of heat, drought, flooding, salinity intrusion, et cetera. So conventional models that have been run under general circulation models, they actually aren't showing so much vulnerability, but they don't capture a lot of these more extreme events. They don't replicate the effects of drought well, for example. So we did our own exercise where we put empirical estimates of what happens with more extreme evapotranspiration together with the model-based estimates. And when you consider them together, there is a lot of vulnerability within developing Asia in terms of agriculture. That vulnerability is primarily in maize and wheat especially in South Asia. Rice is a little bit more mixed picture because it's a little less drought affected. Even as agriculture becomes less productive, people also will become less productive. When temperatures exceed critical thresholds, people basically become less productive, can do less labor, and their labor becomes less productive. We use some empirical estimates of the relationship between temperature and labor productivity, along with climate projections under a high emission scenario to look at what the effects would be on the labor force. And there are very large declines in labor productivity, especially in higher exposure sectors, and especially closer in hotter subtropical and tropical zones. So these losses are concentrated in South and Southeast Asia, and could be up to 30% reduction in high exposure sectors, about half that reduction in less exposed sectors. To cope with heat, there will also be increased demand for cooling, and that causes an increase in electricity demand, particularly for cooling and air conditioning. And that rise is also quite substantial under a high emission scenario. It could be up to 55% in particular countries and regions. Forests obviously will suffer under climate change with slow growing species, slow growing trees. We look into this and find production declines of up to 30%. Higher carbon dioxide concentrations acidify ocean water, and oceans are warming. So this destroys coral reefs and leads to declines in fisheries catches of up to 25%. And then there are other things that are a bit more difficult to capture in models, but are also incredibly important. Health will be adversely affected in a number of ways. There will be more injuries due to more extreme events. There will be mortality, dramatic increases in mortality due to heat waves. Vector-borne diseases will be able to go further. And even the coping capacity and vulnerability of people through their social and human capital will be adversely affected. Violence, criminality, and conflict have been empirically shown to increase under warmer temperatures, and learning outcomes in schools decline as temperatures also exceed critical thresholds, which could lead to declined educational progression, absorption of material, and education will also face more disruption from more extreme events. Previously, we've quantified that a high emission scenario could cause 24% GDP loss by 2100. We run these new shocks through an economy-wide global model that represents the region well. And we find much higher losses than we've reported before. I'm not going to give you the number today. You read the report on 31 October, and then you'll find out the exact number. The rate, those losses also, they increase at an increasing rate, and they're primarily driven by sea level rise, effects on labor productivity, and river-based flooding. And they accrue primarily in more vulnerable countries and regions. But for the specific numbers, please stay tuned. Okay, so then the question is, how can countries respond? And okay, I'm not sure why a slide disappeared. Anyway, adaptation policy is very complex. It is, there are uncertainties around what the emissions trajectory will be in the future. There are uncertainties around how the world will respond to those emissions in terms of its climate. There are uncertainties about what that means in terms of sectoral impacts, and there are uncertainties about how society will develop and how that affects vulnerability in the future. So it is very complicated. There are a lot of cascading risks and interdependencies, and our understanding is continually evolving. So adaptation policy is not like mitigation where there are silver bullet solutions for everything, and it's not something where you can have a sort of set it and forget it kind of policy. It's an area of policy where there's a need to have sort of option value and to continually revisit the risks that the world is facing and our understanding, and also whether the measures we're taking are working, because this is a new set of risks. So adaptation policy is quite complicated. There are many ways of framing adaptation policy. I'm not going to go into all of them, but basically one should keep in mind there's some autonomous adaptation that people respond and adjust and markets adjust without it being planned or sort of without public sector intervention. And then there's a whole range of sort of public sector planned response that can be done. To date, it's tended to be quite fragmented at the project level, small measures. As climate change over time will become much more of a risk, we have to be prepared for more transformational responses and to take much more economy-wide measures, to be cognizant across all planning processes. No sector is immune to climate change impacts, so it's a consideration that needs to be in every sector, and it's always intertwined with development. Development itself increases basically adaptive capacity. So it is a cross-cutting consideration that has to be much more systemic in planning processes and budgeting.
I will have to draw you again, sorry, to a close fairly soon, if that's okay.
Yes. So basically, there are many investments needed, priority investments to address climate risks, include coastal infrastructure, climate proofing infrastructure, addressing river-based risks, and actions. Those are the largest investment needs that have been identified by models, but a whole range of investments is needed in every sector. The actual flow of finance compared with the needs, whether you look based on models or you look based on what countries have requested, there's an enormous gap. So less than 10% of the lowest number put forward in terms of adaptation, investment, and finance needs is actually flowing, and almost all of it is from the public sector. These needs on a per capita basis are not unreasonable. They're for under $150 per capita per year based on the highest estimate. Many are below $100 per capita per year. So these are investments to secure the future. They're very reasonable, but they are not being met by models to date. So finance must be accelerated. This is my final slide, and I'll wrap up very quickly. basically, we don't see the responses needed to contain loss and damage happening. There has to be much stronger response, much more continuous living response that's across all sectors, planning processes, and budgeting. To bridge the financing gap, we need new financing models that can attract much more finance from a much wider array of sources. And there are many enabling conditions needed to make adaptation work. It is quite complicated. There are many market reforms to allow the freedom of markets to transmit climate signals and actors to respond. And a lot of coordination is needed in the future, given the complexity of adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is exactly the kind of perspective we were looking for. Karlygash and Sonja, if you're still there, hopefully, we will be drawing to a close fairly soon. So we would like to be able to ask you a couple of questions, or one question each at least. Sorry to eat into your evening, but we'll now move on to our final speaker. So Takemoto-san, please, if you would.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Akio Takemoto, Head of Program and Administration of...
Use the microphone a bit closer.
Okay, all right. My name is Akio Takemoto, Head of Program and Administration of the United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability based in Tokyo. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting session today. So my institute is a research and teaching institute of the United Nations based in Tokyo, dedicated to sustainable development through policy-oriented research, education, and capacity development. So therefore, I'd like to talk about how we should address climate risk from a bit different angle to complement to the previous speakers. Yes, as already introduced by my colleagues at COP28 last year, the first global stocktake, which is a global assessment on the action for the Paris Agreement, was conducted. The stocktake indicated the global greenhouse gas emissions need to be cut 43% by 2030, compared to 2019 levels, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But it notes parties are off track when it comes to meeting their Paris Agreement goals. So let me show you some evidence. For example, in the case of Japan, its greenhouse gas emission has decreased by 2.5% from fiscal year 2021 to 2022, actually, and which is 19.3% reduction from the level of 2013. This is thanks to the big efforts for enhancing energy efficiencies, energy saving, and promotion of renewable energy of all people of Japan. However, the global greenhouse gas emissions increased by 1.2% from 2021 to 2022. So, which are fully rebounded from the drop in emissions indicated by the COVID-19 pandemic and exceeds the level now. So these higher level greenhouse gas emissions are accumulated into the atmosphere. The atmospheric CO2 and methane concentrations continue to increase in 2023, reaching 419.3 ppm, despite the countries are making efforts to reduce greenhouse gases. So then climate change impacts and its loss and damage are nowadays ubiquitous across the world. The global mean temperature last year was about 1.45 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level already, so very close to 1.5 degree warming, which was the warmest year on record. And it is expected that this year it is broken again. As a result, in Japan, average temperature in this summer broke the record in history. We experienced prolonged heat wave with temperature exceeding 35 degrees Celsius, called the moshobi in Japanese, causing health problems such as health stroke. David says the number of torrential rains would double in the future, but in Asia, but in Japan, it's already happened. We observe a significant increase in the number of heavy rainfall, such as 300 millimeters per day and more, having doubled already since the 1980s. So based on the global stocktake and various science evidence on climate change, so all countries decided at COP28 to accelerate actions to stay on a global pathway to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. So they include tripling of renewable energy capacity and doubling energy efficiency improvements by 2030. The decision also includes accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power, phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that drive the transition away from fossil fuels in energy system in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. This decision itself, quite innovative and ambitious, held in Dubai. So now all parties are encouraged to come forward with ambitious emission reduction targets to align with the 1.5 limit in the next round of climate action plans that should be submitted by 2025 next year. So that also includes Japan. It should be encouraged to for a deep cut of the current 46% reduction target by 2030 to 50% more, in my understanding. So based on the global stocktake, of course, we must enhance reduction of greenhouse gases. However, the world leaders must achieve another commitment. We don't forget about SDGs by 2030. So today, I'd like to highlight the points to address the crisis of climate change, focus on a sustainable development. This is aligned with the message by David ADB from the context of adaptation. So first of all, we must achieve net zero emissions through just and inclusive transition by reigniting SDGs, such as reduction of poverty and social protection. According to the SDGs assessment carried out this year, shows that the world is severely off track to realize the 2030 agenda. So among the targets, only 70% display progress sufficient achieving by 2030, but 80% indicate stagnation and 70% regression below 2015 baseline levels. So from this context, I think we must tackle the current blind spots by incorporating just transition concerns into long-term policy planning and maximizing synergies and minimizing trade-off with SDGs and addressing justice issues. So policymakers shouldn't lose sight of just transition in delivering climate policies. For example, affordability of green energy, human rights implications of decarbonizing projects, disparities in local adaptation capacities, and cultural and psychological impacts of rapid structural change. The key to overcoming this is to deliver a whole systems approach that recognizes synergies and trade-offs across issues and sectors. An integrated whole economy approach to governance is best suited to accelerate the transition and identify synergies across sectors, such as transport and energy, and issues areas like decarbonization and digitalization. We need to be mindful potential opposition and unintended consequences. For example, the adverse human rights and environmental effects of extracting critical minerals needed for green technologies, such as batteries and semiconductors. Second of all, our action towards net zero emissions cannot eliminate all of negative climate impacts, and loss and damage will increase, and additional human natural systems will reach adaptation limits, according to the IPCC. So therefore, it is essential to strengthen resilience to reduce risk on climate change. So governments and local authorities need to develop disaster risk reduction strategies that include enhancement of government structure to promote disaster risk reduction, the creation of hazard maps, early warning systems for extreme events, and multi-stakeholder partnership involving local governments and business and citizens. Perhaps the people like in Japanese thinks such a disaster risk strategy is it's a common. But however, according to the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, currently 126 countries formulate this disaster risk reduction. This means that 1/3 countries in the world still don't have such strategies. Moreover, only 50% of countries, or 97 nations, have implemented early warning systems of natural disasters. With climate change-related losses and damage increasing globally, countries without disaster risk reduction strategies would be regarded as particularly vulnerable to climate impacts. So therefore, countries like Japan, as well as international organizations and the business sector, need to collaborate to support the building of resilience in these vulnerable countries. Third, loss and damage associated with climate impacts are concentrated in the most vulnerable communities in the nations, such as those in remote areas, women, children and youth, and indigenous people, particularly in these developed countries and small island states. Even in Japan, we know, which is one of the most resilient countries, a significant loss and damage occurred caused by record high torrential rain in Noto Peninsula. It was tragedy, but the Noto area has been vulnerable and deficit in resilience since the big earthquake occurred on New Year's Day this year. So therefore, particularly for the most vulnerable communities, the global communities must work together to provide support. So at COP27 in 2022, parties decided to establish a new fund for assisting vulnerable developing countries in responding to loss and damage. And this year, Santiago Network, which is a global network of technical assistance for the vulnerable developing countries, has been operationalized after it was established in 2019. This network, Santiago Network, aims to catalyze technical assistance of relevant organizations, bodies, networks, and experts for the implementation of relevant approach in a broadened areas like risk assessment, creation of a database, policy planning, training, and early warning system, emergency preparedness, addressing non-economic losses, recovery, rehabilitation, and others. So I am personally engaged in the Santiago Network as a co-chair of the advisory board. So on behalf of the board, I'd like to raise your attention to enhance assistance for such vulnerable communities to address loss and damage.
3 minutes, please.
Okay, all right. So lastly, but not least, I'd like to emphasize the importance of human resource development. We should empower the youth and next generations for enabling meaningful participation. Young people and future generations will be disproportionately affected by the ongoing challenges of climate change. So because of this, I believe that providing young people with opportunities to participate in policy-making process to address environmental challenges at the earliest possible stage is a key to solving these issues in the future. So in New York last month, the world leaders adopted the Pact for Future, including decision to support the establishment of mechanism to consult with young people and provide them with meaningful opportunities to engage in policy-making and decision-making processes, and support youth-led and youth-focused organizations in particular through capacity building. So to realize this leadership commitment, it's essential to establish a platform which can provide continuous support for the youth to realize meaningful participation. So in this regard, our institute plays a leading role in empowering youth by providing training and inviting selected youth to our delegations to COP16 on biodiversity, held in Cali, Colombia this month, and COP29 of climate change held in Baku, Azerbaijan next month in collaboration with the private sector and local governments. That's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing additional perspectives. Do we have questions online? I'd like to quickly ask one question, if I may, which is that, obviously what we've heard today is not exactly reassuring. So the question is, where do we go from here, and what do we expect from the COP29 meeting? So Sonja, if you're still there, if you could take that one first. Sonja Gibbs, are you still there?
I'm still here. I didn't quite catch that. Could you repeat?
Okay, well, what we've heard is, I've used the word sobering, but where do we go from here? There are obviously, enormous problems still to be overcome. And what do you think are the priorities from here on? And what do you think is the most we can expect from COP29?
I do think that this notion of kind of speaking with one voice, if the real economy, corporate sector, the financial sector, even financial regulators, civil society, everyone sort of delivers the same message. We need the right policies internationally. We need to be honest about the cost of transition. We need to do things like price carbon appropriately. This is not, some voice in a dusty corner calling out things that are arcane. This is what is absolutely needed to take place. So hopefully at COP we can see more of these conversations.
Okay, Zhunussova, would you like to say something on that?
I agree with Sonja. Also, I think COP29 is important. COP30 is even more important because that is where the countries will submit. By COP30, the countries have to submit their more ambitious NDCs. So I think that will be, and the countries have to start thinking about it now. And yes, the fact that currently what countries do is completely different from what they promised to do by 2050. That is a big problem.
Okay, thank you. David, a few words from you, please.
Yes. So first of all, COP29 is a negotiation between our member countries, right? So we can say what's in the interest of the region, but we can't really take a direct position on what countries our specific countries are negotiating. But it would be good to see. It would be in the interest of Asia for there to be more, and the Pacific for there to be more progress on loss and damage fund contributions. Obviously, we're looking forward to progress on the new collective quantified goal in terms of climate finance to replace the $100 billion per year. We all recognize that much more is needed to address the challenge of climate change. We also, of course, look forward to progress on Article 6 and carbon markets during the COP negotiations. All these things would help in terms of addressing climate risks that the region will face. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. David McNeil has a question, I believe. David, are you there?
Hi, I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, if you speak up just a little bit, please.
Just one second. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Just a really simple political question. One of the candidates in the American presidential election is an outright climate change denier. Do you think he can have a major impact on the sort of scenarios that you've sketched out? Or do you think that it's reached a point where even someone like Trump can't really do much damage?
Is your question directed to any one speaker or to all of the speakers?
Anybody who feels qualified to answer it. I mean, Sonja, I think, is in Washington, right? And David, I guess they would probably be best placed.
Okay, well, Sonja, since it's getting a bit late at your end, do you want to say something quickly on that?
Apologize, my audio is cutting out. Could you just repeat the question quickly?
Yes. Can you hear me now, Sonja?
That's better. Thank you.
I said that one of the candidates in the American presidential election is an outright climate denier. Do you think that he can still have a major impact on the scenarios that you've sketched out today, those very scary scenarios? Or do you think it's reached the point where even somebody like Trump is now, has to acknowledge reality, really?
I think two things. On the more positive side, I think there's a lot of folks who would argue that Kamala Harris is more of a climate activist, you might say, than she's been revealing in the campaign, because it's very difficult to do that when you're talking to voters. That's not what they're interested in. They're interested in the economy and inflation and so on. The thing about Trump is we sort of know what he's about. I mean, it would essentially be a rehash of his playbook, maybe, you know, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, etc. But one thing I would say is that the private financial sector in the United States is very much focused on honoring these client commitments, on delivering the transition finance. And so it's try to disentangle it from the political side of things. One of the most worrisome things about a Trump 2.0 would be, I think, fiscal policy, right? Because there would be just no end to the uses of spending and the reluctance to increase taxation in any sensible manner and so on. So that, I think, could ultimately be very dangerous to future spending priorities. But I think it would be a matter of gritting one's teeth and getting through the next 4 years, if that's so.
Okay, thank you.
David, do you want to have a quick stab at that?
So basically, you know, we don't get into the politics of our member countries, but what one can say is more generally, if countries with more historical responsibility for climate change, higher per capita emissions, if they don't put forward ambitious climate policy on mitigation, other countries then tend to look at that and use that to justify inaction on their part. So there is a risk in terms of basically other countries saying, if these parties aren't acting, why should I? Because it basically addressing climate change depends on coordination and countries acting together. So that is the risk, that we need to maintain the momentum and the ability of countries, of those who are higher emitters, also to do their part, so that everyone is motivated to help address the problem. And it's really everyone acting together that leads to the most benefits for everyone. So we need to try to keep a situation where everyone acts in a coordinated way.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I can't see any other hands raised, but let me, if I may, quickly. Oh, yes, please come on to the microphone. As usual, please identify yourself and ask a question.
My name is Nishimura Freelance. David mentioned that the fact that the energy demand will increase under the hotter temperature scenario. So one of the discussions here in Japan is we need more nuclear power plant to cover the energy demand for data center in Japan. So why do you think is the answer that the nuclear power plant is needed for energy needs? Or why do you think it's not the answer that the nuclear power plant is needed? You can choose one of those two questions.
Go for that first. Would you like to answer that first? Nuclear power as an option to.
Yeah, you know, science says, you know, nuclear power is one of the key options to realize the carbon neutrality as a global scale. So this is, you know, countries' discretion to whether or not to select nuclear power sources to achieve their own targets on greenhouse gases. Yeah, of course, it is very important to have a public involvement, how they will promote a nuclear power policy. Of course, it just happened in Japan. So depending on the risk of earthquake and others, so it's very important to promote fair and transparency process to promote such important policy. This is my understanding. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that? If not, I would like to ask another question, which is, are we going to have to see curbs on consumption, curbs on the use of energy, curbs on travel and transport? I mean, we seem to be at a point where we agree that the response is not keeping pace with the deterioration in the situation. So what's the answer? And as I asked the question a couple of years ago, who's in charge? I mean, there does not seem to be a move towards increased global coordination. So what's going to happen? Can I throw that very general question at you again, Sonja, first? I threw it at you 2 years ago.
Remains a compelling question, right? I mean, it's kind of what I was talking about. The point is that behavior has to change. Household behavior, corporate behavior, government behavior. If we don't change our behavior, and you mentioned energy consumption, and that's an important part of it, right? How we consume energy and how much of it, and the relative rates of consumption in different places, right? I mean, as it stands now, and it's part of the reason why the whole loss and damage question comes up. We are asking emerging and developing economies to cut down on their consumption, change their behavior in a way that mature economies simply didn't. For decades, they profited from cheap energy. We're asking everybody to change behavior. The point is that behavior has to change, and policymakers have to have the courage to demand those changes. So you're right, behavior has to change.
Okay. Zhunussova, do you want to say something quickly on that? Behavior has to change. In other words, we need far more drastic measures.
I think also starting to decarbonizing sectors as soon as possible. It's the question of the capital turnover, right? The buildings exist 50 years more. So if they are energy inefficient right now, there is no way they will be energy efficient in 2050 when the whole world needs to be net zero. That's one. And on the global cooperation, G20 countries account for 80% of global emissions. If we don't even talk about G20 countries, but the 6 biggest emitters, US, China, India, European Union, even these 4, they account for the bulk of emission, and they would, if they are doing the actions that are driving the mitigation as much as possible, other countries will pick it up. The same way how, I don't know, the success of solar energy that used to be very expensive, its technology got very, very well developed because of heavy investment from Germany historically, right? And now the whole world is benefiting from cheaper solar energy. So I think this is the question of, I would say Paris Agreement is a great tool, but it's 195 countries and everyone cannot agree on anything. It's very hard to agree. But if just 4-6 countries would agree to really mitigate their emissions, it would benefit the whole world.
Okay. David, do you want to add a few words quickly on that or not?
I do want to add a couple of things. So if we had really ambitious mitigation policy, if there were ambitious carbon pricing, there will be innovation that's induced. So it's not a matter that we have to think that it's all just cutting activities. It will be that services, products, energy decarbonize and evolve so that we don't lose the services as much as you might think with current technology. There will be a lot of innovation. There will also be, if you had really ambitious, comprehensive carbon pricing, There will be a lot of, for example, afforestation. There will be a lot of carbon that gets captured. So it's not only all cutting the emissions, but it's cutting the net emissions. So both having more tree cover, reduced deforestation, potentially you could end up with biomass, with carbon capture and storage, where you get actually negative emissions out of energy in the future. So it's not all, everything necessarily has to get cut. It would be just a very different future than that we have right now. Obviously, some activities are extremely emissions intensive, where it's much harder to get the technical progress. Those things may be reduced, but it's not going to be that we have to radically cut our standard of living or whatnot. It's that we have to create the incentives so that we move to a low carbon economy. And I did just want to say one other thing. When you look at scenarios like this, people do refer to nuclear, but nuclear actually doesn't usually come out as a very big part of the picture, because the technical progress is expected much more in renewables. So that's the kind of energy system that becomes the lowest cost in the future if you had something like a very high carbon price in place. Thank you.
Thank you. Some good and positive points. Okay, Takemoto.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to touch upon the comments by Sonja on the importance of behavior change. Yes. I think behavior change requires informed data. So perhaps many of us don't understand how much greenhouse gases come from the food system. So food comprises of 1/3 of the total greenhouse gases. But in Japan, we import 60% of foods from other countries. That incorporates a huge amount of greenhouse gases. Such a carbon footprint on food products and services should be informed to the consumers, Japanese people. And according to the IPCC, there's huge potential to cut the greenhouse gases amounting to 1.9 gigaton through the sustainable consumption food. So it is enormous. So consumers can have a good decision through changing the diet from the carbon intensive foods like beef to more carbon less food products, and also we can make efforts to reduce food waste and food loss. By way of that, we can change our environment. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm afraid time has overtaken us. It's time for us all here in Tokyo to go out into the 36-degree outside world. I'd like to particularly thank Zhunussova and Sonja for eating into their evenings. I hope you can still enjoy your supper or dinner after this. And I'd like to thank our other panelists, David in Manila, thank you, and Takemoto-san here. I think, that it's 2 years since we had this last event on this subject, and I think it's of such critical interest that we may well have another one in a year's time. But in the meantime, as I said, thank you very much to our panelists. Please join me in thanking them. And that ends the event. Thank you.